The renewed vision of the homily that came out of the Second Vatican Council emphasized careful preparation. It was emphasized in the writings of St. John Paul II. It was emphasized in the writings of Pope Benedict. And this idea of careful preparation was not vertical preparation, one day, one evening before the preaching, but was an extended horizontal preparation over many days, which was to involve many different steps: prayer and contemplation, study, consultation of commentaries, and more. We've discussed these steps in other videos. But all of this was to get at a final homily for preaching, which was not superficial, but which had real depth in it and was doing a spiritual good for the people. And this emphasis on careful preparation, extended preparation, involving many aspects from prayer through to study, was also a response to what Pope St. Paul VI reminded us, and it comes out of the Council of Trent, that preaching is the primary apostolate. When a preacher takes this to heart and does all of this, then the preacher runs across a problem. After many days of this kind of contemplation, prayer, study, consultation with text, reading, and so on, the preacher then develops a wide breadth of insights, insights which are deep. The preacher begins to see Scripture as like an onion, which many different layers and many nuances, and he explores all of this and comes up with many rich treasures. Well then, after having spent all of this time, is the preacher meant to pull all of this together and put all of this into a homily, particularly a rather concise homily, at least in the North American experience? Well, if he does that, then he's probably then just going to be listing ideas, because there will not be enough time to deal with anyone in any great depth. In other words, doing short shrift to all of this and overloading the congregation with different thoughts and different concepts. So what is the preacher meant to do? Well, the renewed vision of preaching from the council has asked preachers to do this preparation, but to preach a focused homily, a homily focused on a single message that does a spiritual good. This idea of focusing on a single message rather than a lot of ideas was advocated by St. John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, in the last century in his wonderful book, The Idea of a University. He compared preaching to a bullseye. Here's what he says. He says, as a marksman aims at the target and its bullseye and at nothing else, so the preacher must have a definite point before him, which he has to hit, a definite point, which he's to aim at. I would go the length, he says, of recommending a preacher to place a distinct categorical proposition before him, such as he could write down in a form of words, and to guide and limit his preparation by it, and to aim in all he says to bring it out and nothing else. In other words, the preacher should be able to, in a single sentence, come up with his idea, his message. And like a thesis statement in an essay, or like a topic sentence in a paragraph, it becomes the gatekeeper for the content, that it only allows into the homily whatever which is particularly focused on that, not side points or sub points or going off into different directions or digressions. But he says, make it a very focused homily, controlled by a single idea, a single target, a single bullseye. He continues, nothing is so fatal to the effect of a sermon as the habit of preaching on 3 or 4 subjects at once. It's fatal, he said. I acknowledge I am advancing a step beyond the practice of great Catholic preachers when I add that even though we preach on only one at a time, finishing and dismissing the first before we go to the second, and the second before we go to the third. Still, after all, a practice like this though not open to the inconvenience which the confusing of one subject with another involves, is still, in fact, nothing short of the delivery of 3 sermons in succession without break between them. So Cardinal Newman is saying, rather than the maybe medieval scholastic method or the 3-point homily or other methods of preaching, which involve more than one main point and subpoints and so on, and can get very complicated, he advocated a single direct approach focused on a single target. Well, in this century, the great preacher and the great advocate of great preaching, Bishop Ken Untener, in his marvelous book, Preaching Better, rather than using the term target or bullseye, likes to use the term pearl. He says that every homily should have a single pearl, the pearl of great price, the pearl in the field that the merchant would sell everything for. A single message, a single pearl that can remain in the thinking, that is a memorable of the listener, that is a memorable point to make. And here's what he says about the pearl. He said, there's a difference between one theme and one core thought, which is the pearl. If a homily is united simply by a common theme, it usually moves horizontally, at surface level, from one thought to another, and results in too many thoughts and little depth. This is a consequence of one from the other. Too many thoughts moving from one to another means necessarily too little depth, because you don't have time to deal with each one. He continues, if a homily revolves around a pearl, it goes down vertically into the depth of one thought. If asked for the core thought of a homily, the person with many thoughts will say the theme. My theme is generosity. My theme is salvation, whatever it might be. But the person with one good thought can give the pearl. So this is the thinking that the Second Vatican Council advocates and picks up. And we see it in particularly as well in the writings of the recent popes. And a good example of this is Pope Francis in his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, which comes out after the Synod on the new evangelization. And in that document, which covers in many, many sections his concept and what he is asking for from preachers, he says in 157 that he's advocating the same idea, this idea of a bullseye, a target, or a pearl. Here's how he puts it. He says in 157, a successful image can make people savor the message, awaken a desire, and move the will toward the gospel. A good homily, an old teacher once told me, should have one idea, one sentiment, and one image. So this Pope is advocating more than examples or stories. He's advocating preaching which has strong imagery, imagery that later on, when recollected, can open up what was said in the homily. But what was said in the homily was a single message, a single idea, not a single theme, but a single particular message or theme. So if that's the case, if that's what we are being asked to do, the question then becomes for the preacher, how do I do that? If you've asked me to do all this preparation, to do all this deepening, to do all this thinking and praying and consultation, now I have all of these resources. How do I focus this down? How do I put it into a single pearl or a single target? Well, there are a couple of ways to do this. One way that, or one basic guiding principle for all of this that homiletic writers advocate actually comes out of the writings 1913, 1914 by Sir Arthur Quiller Couch at Cambridge in England. He had a series of lectures on the art of writing, and those lectures have become a classic book. It's still available and still guides writing. And in that, in his lectures, Sir Arthur Quiller Couch says that a very important principle is to murder your darlings. What he means by murdering your darlings is that every thought, every idea, every inspiration that comes to you seems very precious, and they're like your children. But at some point, you have to murder the darlings, which do not fit a controlling message, a controlling target, a controlling pearl. And it's not quite so devastating as murder, because you will be putting insights aside, knowing that you're preaching to that congregation again at another time, at an appropriate set of readings, in an appropriate situation. That insight will be able to come up again. But if you put in too many insights or too many points, what can happen is that some of your main point can start to get buried and start to compete with other ideas. The people, after all, are not taking notes. They are not in a lecture situation. This is what Pope Benedict spoke about when he was when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, and wrote extensively in various pieces, which have been collected in a wonderful book called On Dogma and Preaching. And one of the things that he spoke about this is that so much that part of the crisis of preaching, he writes, is that preaching is often being produced merely by simplifying theological reflection and its language, dumbing down the theological lectures in a seminary. And a homily is not a lecture, as the homiletic directory insists. It's not a lecture, it's not a speech. A lecture has a longer time, 50 minutes, 2 hours. A lecture, by its very nature, is a situation for people to take notes and to do this kind of analysis, and it's an academic exercise. People in the pews are not taking notes. People are not there listening to a lecture. It's a whole different situation. So the preacher then needs to go through his resources, but then murder the darlings down so that he has a particular point. So how do you murder the darlings? What do you do with that? Well, one way to help with this is to have a consistent method to help the preacher identify what his target should be. One way of doing that is to start with the liturgical text of that Mass. The antiphons, the collects, the closing prayer, the prayer over the gifts, and so on. What are they saying? Because the church has put this together, and the church is giving us a message in these liturgical texts. So in another video, when I speak about preparation of the homily, I speak about a contemplation first before one even reads the lectionary text, that one spends time meditating upon the liturgical text, which actually in the end can become the subject of the homily. The next thing is then the preacher can look at must look at the lectionary text, and to see them, as the homiletic directory calls us, as a constellation of readings which are self-revelatory or mutually revelatory, so that they reveal each other, they comment on each other. So now what you're looking at is, how do the lectionary readings and the liturgical texts, how do they mutually reveal each other, and out of them comes a pearl, out of a particular message. But then the preacher can't stop there. In both Verbum Domini by Pope Benedict and Evangelii Gaudium by Pope Francis, both popes give a 3-step series of questions for the homilist to use to arrive at that point, to arrive at that target, that pearl. The first one is what we've just spoken about, to deal fully with the text. What do the texts say? But to look for their convergence, to look for how they mutually reveal each other. And so there are going to be different things, different ideas that maybe occur only in one text, which do not apply. So we'll hold those for now. What is it that converges and what emerges out of it? The second question was then to say, or is for the preacher to contemplate, to meditate, to pray about how those texts impact his life. Where are they in his life? How do they challenge his life? Where has he not been able to live up to them, for example, or where he might have experiences which kind of elucidate some experience or relationship he might have had, which elucidates that for him a little bit more. Not that he's necessarily going to tell that story in the homily, but it helps form the foundation, the basis of what he's going to say. But then there's a third question. Now that the preacher has looked at the constellation of readings, lectionary and liturgical, looked for their convergence, look for the pearl that comes out, then look at what his own experience says about this, or what adjustment that his experience brings to this, which helps clarify it for himself. Then the third question, both popes say, is then to determine what is it that the particular congregation in front of you needs to hear. This is what the homiletic directory means when it says that the homily is to be targeted. So the preacher then says, well, okay, I've got this pearl, and I can clarify it and elucidate it through my own experience. But how does that particular message impact or connect with this particular group? What about it do they need to hear? And so then again, the preacher refines that point, that single point, which he has developed and thought about, contemplated through his experience. He now refines that point so that it is now adjusted, to the needs. Is this a well-off community? Is this a challenged community in some way? Is this a conflicted community? Is this rural community, urban? Are these people who are going through some particular stresses right now with job layoffs or whatever it might be? What is it that their experience is, that now I bring this to it, and out of that a refined and targeted bullseye emerges, a pearl which comes just for these people. When that is all done, then the preacher can use the advice of St. John Henry Newman, which is, he says, to put out a proposition in a few words. He can use the technique of Thomas Long, who in Witness to Preaching advocates for a preacher to write two sentences. One is called the focus statement, and the other one is called the function statement. And the focus statement is in a single sentence to put down what it is that the pearl is, what is the message that arises out of all of these texts, his experience and the needs of the congregation. Single sentence. And I advocate, if at all possible, to avoid using the word and, because when the word and is used in the focus statement, it's often just a trick to join two clauses, which really is joining two different points. The Bible, the scripture tells us this and this. It's joining it together in one. If you discipline yourself not to use the word and, it helps you keep focused on what is the main thing that you are going to do, which is going to become the gatekeeper for all the information in the homily. And then there is the function statement. The function statement is a single statement you write for yourself. It doesn't have to end up being in the homily, but it's what you expect this focus statement to actually do, what you expect the homily to actually do. Is it going to encourage? Is it going to inspire? Is it going to call to conversion? What is it actually going to do in the psyche, the soul, the imaginations, the emotions, the life of the people? What is the spiritual good that it's going to do? When you do all of this, you have based a single pearl or target. You've based it upon the richness of Scripture, the richness of tradition, the experience of the preacher, and the needs of the listener.